Hey guys, I'm Shao here, OG Rose. I'm so excited to be speaking with Vanessa today. It is an honor and a pleasure. We've been talking a little bit back and forth through Instagram, and it's just such a joy to finally get to talk with you in real time, face to face as much as we can through this virtual platform and have a conversation with you. Vanessa is an existential therapist and writer, and she's working on a lot of her own things right now too with your PhD, I believe, your thesis. So that's very exciting as well. So I'm just so honored and so thankful to have you here today, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for having me, Michelle. I'm really excited to be here.
Yay, me too. I'm so happy we can talk together in more of a long form way. So yes, I'm really interested in, I think personally about philosophy and, why am I even interested in it? Why do I like read and think about certain questions that are a little bit more, abstract. People think of these as abstract questions. Um, why do I do that? And a lot of times, like, well, one, there's a part of me that's just kind of this almost insatiable curiosity that it's hard to sort of like not ask certain questions and or have certain things come to mind. Um, but I also think that sometimes when I would encounter like conflict or just things that are hard in life, things that you strike you as like this is difficult or this is painful, or I see a loved one going through this and I just seem like I feel like I can't help them, and then it starts that that would often be the motivator for these questions, these more philosophical questions. Well, why do we define things the way we do? Why do we see this X or that or the other as a problem? Is it really a problem? All of that. So that's kind of what got me into thinking about more in a way like philosophically. But I do sometimes think that a lot of people think of philosophy just as like this obtuse abstract thing that's just has to do with really large books that are really complicated language and word salads, and it's like I kind of wonder, I don't know if it's just that it merely does take sort of like an experience that really drives you toward it. I don't think anyone has to, but I guess it's been helpful for me, but I don't think that means it's necessarily helpful for everybody. But what do you think is a way that philosophy could be made more like accessible to the everyday person? Um, can it be, is there a way for people who maybe are in the philosophy world, whatever that means, to be able to make it more like friendly just to the everyday person? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love that question. Um, I have a very similar experience of being a very curious person and always have been. Like even in childhood, I remember having sort of philosophical questions and just really big questions about life and being really curious about things. And so I do think that there is a tendency that some people have sort of innately towards that um, deeper curiosities in life. But as far as like philosophy being so like esoteric and people sort of bristle at the thought of it, like it's not something that they were going to understand or they or it just it's unappealing in some way. I'm not really sure what it is exactly, probably intimidating, or there's a certain sense of snobbery about it. Maybe it is like the stigma too, that it's so scholarly and it's not for everyday life. But I believe it is everyday life. And our existence is philosophical by nature. Like all of these big philosophical questions aren't big scholarly questions. They exist in the day-to-day living of life. And I think that maybe if we can showcase that a little bit more clearly, even just in some language perhaps, or just like bringing it down out of the abstract theorizing and into the concrete everyday. I think that might be a way in.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful answer for that. And yeah, I agree. I agree. Like I have this kind of theory that philosophy is kind of like air. And that well, it's kind of a bigger analogy of like religion kind of being like the earth and philosophy being the air, being air. And why I say that is it actually reminds me of like a quote from Ayn Rand where she says that philosophy is like secondhand smoke. Basically, like if you're not made aware of what air you're breathing, you're just going to breathe somebody else's air. You're just going to, you're going to have certain things that you think or do or say or believe simply because somebody else did around you. And so, her big thing is to really be like intentional with kind of being philosophical, because that way you can have, at least, even if you're going to end up believing what the other people believe or doing what the other people do, at least you have this awareness of it, right? And you have this sort of better sense of agency and sort of I don't know, this sort of self-awareness too within that. And so I guess that for me, it sort of feels that way, that like there's this, the kind of the idea too of the zeitgeist of the age, right? There's this sort of like the spirit, it's all associated with breath and air and all of that. So it's sort of like that to me is why I think philosophy, it is it is so much part of the quotidian, almost so much so that we can't see it, right? Just like you can't see air, you know, you can't see it, and yet it's the very thing by which we like exist, right? You know, we exist from our philosophies and the ways we think about them. And you know, maybe people might kind of like squirm a bit, like, well, don't, you know, just because I have a way of thinking about something, don't call it a philosophy. And it's like, that's fine. We can, it's fine. If people don't feel comfortable with that term, they don't have to necessarily use it. But I think perhaps what is helpful about understanding that it is indeed a philosophy, or that one is philosophizing, is because then you can actually like develop that more, right? Like you can actually develop that skill more and hone in on maybe some of the things that, you know, one's way of thinking, everyone's way of thinking is going to have pitfalls, right? And like pros and cons, there's going to be really great benefits to it, and there's going to be things that are drawbacks. And even the philosophical pursuit itself has its pros and cons. Our great friend Samuel Barnes wrote a book called The Iconoclast and Anti-Philosophy, and he's kind of grappling with that question of like, at the end of the day, is it even like worthwhile of a pursuit if we end up kind of in this sort of oscillation between dogmatism and being an iconoclast, right? And because ultimately you sort of have to sort of fall into some sort of dogmatism, even if it's just simply like the fact that you have to get up and make eggs just like everybody else does, or whatever, make your food just like everybody else does. And so everything will have its pros and cons. However, I think for another thing for me that's been personally helpful about philosophy is actually in its negation, right? Like if we think about Hegel, if we think about negation of our thinking, of our experience, of our reality, what's helpful for me about that is to say, oh, what I feel so certain about, I might not be so, like, it might actually not be that certain. I just feel it's that certain, or I want it to be that certain. And so it kind of allowed, philosophy for me has helped me to like loosen my grip a bit, like which, yeah, that's the whole point of it feeling existentially destabilizing, because everything's kind of getting shaken. But at the same time, there's something freeing about that too, because the things that I was so certain about that were very tormenting, like, oh, I'm certain this person feels this way about me, or I'm certain about that, you know, it's like, just negate that. Like, just realize that you have the certainty and you feel the certainty, but you're not, like, what is that grounded in? Actually, it's your it's almost a type of just belief that it is that way, when really a lot of times, especially when it comes to what do other people think of us, we don't know. You know, we don't know what they think of us necessarily. And so for me, that's the freedom of it in its negation. Like there's something really powerful about philosophy that deconstructs, and that's very good, because a lot of times, yeah, like if the thing that's constructed is boding well for you, that's great. But if it's not, then the fact that it could be deconstructed actually helps to bring some alleviation and reconstruction in a manner that is now oriented more so on reality, and not just like, and that's the funny thing. It's almost like before we were just in idea land. Like we just had our ideas of like, oh, well, if we just take that concrete example, oh, what does this person think of me? That's an idea. Right. So it's really funny, because actually philosophy tries to get you, like you're saying, toward the more concrete, which is very strange, because it takes this sort of abstracting to get to something more concrete. So anyways, those are my thoughts that came to mind. What do you think?
Yeah, no, totally. I love that. There's sort of three things that stand out to me. I'll see if I can remember them all now. But the awareness piece, when you talked about the Ayn Rand quote, I think that is absolutely paramount um, to be like showing up and like fully participating in your existence, and in like an actively engaged way to encounter what it is before you, and the people and your life and situations and all of that, and to be fully aware of how all of that impacts you and how you impact it, and not just sort of going along with these preconceived notions, like you mentioned, breathing in secondhand smoke. Yeah, I think that's like a really, really critical piece to be able to build up that awareness and to really encounter life, which I think brings me to the concrete piece that you spoke of. That well, I'm kind of losing my train of thought now.
Oh, that's
I'm
okay.
so
That's okay.
excited, like listening to everything you were saying and
I
trying to
got
remember.
like, this is what I have to keep on doing. So I'm like, I'm going to forget. Like, if I don't write it down, especially as a mom of three small kids, like, it's not written down. It's okay if you remember it, you know?
Totally.
Yeah.
So the concrete piece, all we know is our own experience. So when you say we don't really know what other people think of us, the only way to really understand our experience is to be as concrete as possible, to have our own awareness and the facts about the situation. And we can't really generalize, well, what do people think of other people? It's always like really concrete about your experience of the situation. And it's not always factual either. Like if your experience is that this person doesn't like you, it's true that that's your experience, whether or not if it's true that they like you or not. So that's
Yeah.
relevant here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Like that there can be, and I think that's what's so powerful is to sort of realize there's I don't want to say there's frame of references, right? There's like this, for you, you may feel that this person doesn't like you, but that's your truth of experience in a way, but it's not necessarily the ultimate truth, because the other person might be like, oh, no, it's not that at all. I was just having a really bad day, or like whatever. They were putting, they ended up purporting in a way that communicated something that it was not true. It was interpreted that way, by the person receiving it. Um, so that's really, really interesting. And I kind of wonder, Vanessa, when because you work with people, like you have like clients. So it's like you talk with them about these sorts of things. So like do you feel like people who come to work with you, are they already like open to philosophy, or are they like, what? It's kind of interesting because like that's for me, I feel like that would be super powerful to combine existentialism or philosophy and therapy. But a lot of times people may go in the more psychoanalytical realm or whatever. So well, first of all, is there a main difference between like psychoanalytical clinical psychoanalytics, or that's not the word, psychoanalysis, or and clinical existential therapy? Is there a difference? And then also, are the people who come to you, are they typically like, why might they seek existential therapy over other types of therapy or other types of counseling?
Yeah, great question. So I do definitely get clients that are drawn to the philosophy of it, and they're like, that sounded really cool, and I'm into that sort of thing, and I want to talk about it. But those are probably rarer, and mostly I don't describe what I do in very philosophical terms. Like I talk about the different kind of explorations that we could do together, and that's what draws people. And they all happen to be questions about, the big questions about life and meaning and identity and being in the world and existing at its core. So whether people know it or not, they are drawn to the philosophy of it all. Because that's sort of what I was saying earlier, is that it is our day-to-day life. These are the questions on our minds. These are the problems we're always trying to solve, whether or not we think we're doing it philosophically or not. So to sort of answer your question about like the types of therapy, I guess I'll tell you a little bit about the type of therapy that I use. So there's many different schools of existential therapy. And the school that I ascribe to is existential analysis, which was developed by Alfred Langler, who worked with Viktor Frankl. So it was actually developed out of Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. So it's like heavily rooted in that philosophy and some existential philosophies of that time. So it, like, from its inception, it was like a blend of philosophical perspectives and psychological underpinnings. So they've always been very married in this perspective.
Yeah, wow, that's so cool. I didn't even know that was like such a there was that existed. That's
Yeah,
so incredible. Like I know Viktor Frankl, but it's like, oh, I didn't even know
exactly.
he had a logos therapy. Did you say is that what it's called?
Yeah, logotherapy. Yeah.
Like, okay, that's so incredible. Wow. Wow, that is so, so cool. Um, well, that's awesome. And I was looking at your website a bit more, and I always really appreciate your post through Instagram. And I did notice that, especially the language you use on your website there's something almost like that is playful, explorative about how to sort of approach new situations again. So would you say that and to me, like, that's why I always think like also children are the perfect philosophers, they're always asking the questions, mommy, why is the sky blue? Why is, they're just asking questions all day long, that are very philosophical in nature. And to me, I think that's so, so beautiful. And so it's that curiosity, that sort of drive to be more like, to know more about the world that we're in, that is philosophical. And I think that the beautiful thing about children too is they don't often think about it in terms of being wrong or like that's a silly question. They don't. And that's great. That's why we should encourage their questions and encourage people's questions in general. And I do think sometimes like I can even remember sometimes feeling, especially in certain classes or in school, though there's school is a wonderful place. But the one risk is that sometimes we think about it in terms of a right answer or even a right question, or we're given the questions, so we don't have an opportunity to formulate those questions ourselves. But yeah, like the idea that people have there's something very playful, I think that I found in the language on your website. So I was wondering, is that something that like is that does therapy often look like that, where you're taking particular scenarios that really happen to the person and you're sort of thinking about how to think about them in a new way? Yeah, so just tell me, I'd love to hear more about like the playful aspect. Anyways, I guess what I was trying to say in all of that I just said was that playfulness to me is very philosophical. Like I think there's something about play and exploration that is philosophy itself, and there's something about there's something so ripe about that and so true about that. And I guess that's why for me I'm always like philosophy, like I think there's something so great about it. I get so excited about it. And why I think it's so interesting for people to, because also there's, sorry, one more thing, our friend Samuel Barnes with his book talks about how there's a philosophy of everything. So like if you're interested in like baseball, like literally there's a way in which you can think about philosophy for baseball or in that sphere. There's wisdom there, right? Love of wisdom is what philosophy is. So it's like that's the other cool thing too. Whatever somebody just has an intrinsic motivation to do or an interest in can really be like mined for more of what it is all about. And that's really exciting for that person because they already like it, they already love it. So yeah, so I'm curious about your approach with clients on what you guys do together and like what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So the playfulness and the curiosity that you speak of with children, I think is a really great example, because some of like my best philosophical questions I could think I asked when I was like under the age of 10. So like I
Yeah,
totally
right.
agree that like we're born philosophers, and it's what I think is most important is the sense of openness and curiosity, and curiosity for curiosity's sake, and not just because there's some right answer you're trying to find, or you have to come to some kind of conclusion, or like you said, even ask the right question, but just like basically being as nosy as possible about what it is to be in this universe is, I think, the best gift. Because so often, like when I think of phenomenology, a sense of coming to it, like sort of bracketing our preconceived notions and coming to a problem anew. And that's both for me as the therapist and for the client. So I can't ever meet with the client and think, oh, I've seen this before. I know what's going on here, because I haven't seen it before. Because even if it's an issue I've seen a million times, this is a new person and a new context, and it's not going to be the same.
Yeah.
So even for me initially to suspend any wisdom I think I might be bringing to the table and just see what really is there first. And then also to try to instill that perspective in the client as well, so that they can start to see life and their struggles in that way as well. Because I think we so often jump to problem solving before we even really know what the problem is, because it's not comfortable to sit with discomfort. And we're kind of trained to get away from that as quickly as possible. We're trained that discomfort is bad, that when things are unsettled or questions are unanswered, that that's a problem that needs to be fixed. It's not a place we're supposed to linger. So I think that there's a disservice in not lingering. So that's what I try to do, like in the phenomenological approach, to just really sit with things more and try to like peel back the layers more and more to see what's really at the bottom of all of this before we can even begin to know how to tackle it. And you have to be really open and really curious to do that.
That's so good. That was so beautiful, Vanessa. I loved hearing more about that process, and that's so great. And I thought that was a brilliant point about like we jump into problem solving mode when we don't even know like what is really the problem. Why is it a problem? You know, how is it a problem? And that's really fascinating. And I wonder then, like, that seems like there would be a lot of just questions about what it is to even begin with, like just sort of in sort of like a yeah, like a playful Socratic sort of way, like kind of it's under finding out like what are the underpinnings of this frustration or conflict or issue. And that's amazing how powerful that can be. And I was also thinking like that idea of like not wanting to linger in what's uncomfortable, or assuming, like that was such a great point too, where it's like even if I've seen the situation a lot, it's never the same, right? It's never the same even for you, because it's a new person, a new circumstance, a new situation. And I think that's really powerful and really takes a lot on your part too, to be able to see it in you every time. So it's interesting how it's like it works on you as you also address the client, right? Like I think that's a really amazing thing. And that's different because sometimes, you know, you can you can kind of have, and I mean, I can understand how it can happen, but it's sort of this idea that it's just seeing, you know, you've seen it when you do start to be like, oh, I've just seen this a million times. I know what, you know, it's like, no, like every single moment is like a miracle. And it's every single situation is like so fascinating and so unique and so particular. And the particularity of it is everything. Like it's just, so anyways, I think that's really amazing. And probably like, I wonder if there's sort of this reciprocity of working on your own, just sort of like your own ability to do the very thing that you're encouraging your clients to do, because you're doing it together in this sort of like relational way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely the case. There's so much in the relationship and the shared collaborative experience of sort of tackling this problem together, or even just whatever comes up in our relationship as we get to know each other better. And yeah, it's definitely a shared experience for sure. And it's something that I just find deeply beautiful, that it's never, the life always has the potential to surprise me. And
Yes.
I never get tired of that.
That's so wonderful and so beautifully said. Yeah, it makes me think about a lot about wonder. And actually, like even as you were sharing about your approach that you have, like in this relational work, like with your clients, it made me think about how it's so interesting, because I think too, even if we have a propensity to curiosity, it's very difficult in real time, in real life, to sometimes be willing to see something in a new way again, right? Because it's like, oh, like this again, I know what this is. And I don't know if it's just our brains kind of wanting to compartmentalize it, or be like, yes, like we don't have to think about this, or we don't have to do anything with this, because this is how we always handle this, and that's fine. Like it's actually not great, but it's just like we'll just be like, it's fine, I'll just do that, or whatever. Or it might require actually like vulnerability, right? Because if it's like not being on the same page with somebody, for example, like let's just take that as an example, then you have to be vulnerable about that. And what if you're misunderstood? And you know, it's a very difficult thing in relations, whether it's, you know, like in family relations, any type of relation you have, it's difficult to sort of, you have to be willing to be vulnerable again, though, to get back into, like, to linger in the discomfort and say like this, you know, if this is something that could ultimately be something that could be something to work on or to refine or do better, or to, to really show up more as yourself. Like, I think that, and I brought this up to you, I think, Vanessa, in like some of our off record talking about like this idea of sort of like being able to fully be yourself, but then also learning to be in relation to another person, but how to not like lose your sense of self, but still be very adapting and adaptive in creating this new sort of relation with the other. And I think, like, to me, that's really interesting. And I'll ask a specific question on that in a second. But just to finish what I was just saying is like this idea that seeing things new again, it's probably just because, well, one, we get used to not seeing it like a new thing, right? And we sort of assume it is new because it almost feels illogical. Like, why would we see this as new again? We've seen this a million times. And especially if it is in let's say a particular familial relationship or something, it is the same. It is the same, but it's not, right? It's never the same. And you can't always just see it newly, even if the situation itself is the same. It's still a new day. It's still a new chance to see it with a different lens, to see it from a different angle, and all of that. So I think that's, I don't know, that was just pretty powerful for me, the way you were talking about it and being like, wow, yeah, like and I just started thinking, like, internally reflect on like, I wonder what things I tend to see the same way, or sort of think can't be approached again, or whatever, that, often you can see from a new light or new angle. And I think it's often has to do, and it'll feed into the next question, of just the fact that some people, probably myself, if I'm honest, can be like conflict averse. So it's like, no, like just peace, harmony, like everything's good. And that's great to like desire harmony and peace, and like not want to just seek out battles and drama and all of that. Like, there's something good about it. But the risk is that there can be a sense of never really showing up fully as yourself, because you're like, oh, I might step on somebody's toes, or, oh, I'm asking too much, or things like that. So I don't know. I guess because I have an identical twin sister, and I mentioned that to you, I think
Yeah.
it's kind of easier to show up fully as yourself if the other person who's fully themselves is just like you, like same, like same things that get you excited, same thing, same, desire to have snacks at the same time. Like, literally, so much is the same. Like, even the little silly funny things are the same. And same, things that we might just have a propensity to do, or how we'd want to spend free time, or whatever, or how we'd help each other. It's just all very in sync. So it's like, it's easy to show up there because
there's less risk involved.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, like, how do you, that's so interesting to me, because it's just like, yeah, no, like, I don't know, I would love to hear more about like what your thoughts are on that topic, and kind of being able to show up fully as yourself and embrace risk, but also not be just sort of like, I don't know, to not be like just a mere imposition on the other person.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So if I could go back even a little bit further to the point you were making about like why we maybe don't want to see things anew. So like, first of all, I think that is an adaptive strategy, that once we've learned something, now we have like a shortcut. So if we encounter it again, we don't have to go through the whole process all over again. We already know how to handle the situation. So it's an adaptive strategy, for survival, and that we don't always have to use so much brain power. Every time we encounter something familiar, we already have some blueprints to work off of. So in some ways, this idea of approaching things phenomenologically, it could be argued that it goes against some of our nature to take those easy shortcuts, because what you said earlier is that it takes a tremendous amount of vulnerability and effort to do that, to engage in that way.
Yeah.
So I think that yes, a lot of us are conflict averse, but I also think it is just human nature to, if we think we have an answer, to not try to reinvent the wheel every time. And that's when we get sort of stuck in patterns. If the wheel we invented the first time maybe wasn't all that helpful, and we just keep using it.
Yeah, that's such a great point. The adaptive. Yeah. I mean, it's the brain kind of just wants to simplify, and it's like you're saying, it's for survival. It's ultimately like, what's really necessary to take care of or not. And often these things, because they work well enough. So it's like, why even go there? So what do you think, like, how can somebody identify if they need to sort of go there again? And what's like one of the number one things you think about sort of reenacting or maybe practice playing in terms of being able to take risks, like to be able to, yeah, like how does one even do that besides, I guess, just, I don't know, is it just practice? Like, is it just literally just do it?
Well, I mean, there is a lot of that involved. Like you have to be um, willing to take that sort of vulnerable position and take a chance because there is an element of like trust and courage needed to explore these things because there's so much uncertainty.
Hmm.
Um, and that's true of what you're saying in relationships as well. Like how do we show up as ourselves and how much of ourself is permitted and how much is crossing some sort of line and becoming an imposition and how much can the other person receive of us. All of that is, a bit of trial and error. Like you don't know
Yeah.
until you give it a shot. And I mean, there are some things you can do to prepare. Like you can really consider the situation and your feelings in it and like you don't have to you can take baby steps towards diving in, but yeah, there's really not any way to avoid risk. I mean, you can avoid risk by doing nothing, and that's kind of the only way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's so great because it seems like it is such a, there's like this kind of dialectical process with oneself where you have to sort of be willing to rethink things and not just, I mean, yeah, I think that also to be have this self-awareness, like are you just inventing a problem or are you identifying one? And that may seem so simple, but sometimes that's not. And I think sometimes if there's a conflict aversion, then there's going to be this desire to not, just to sort of err on the side of like, well, no problems, everything's fine, which maybe everything is fine. And ultimately, like it does sort of first this process of kind of working with yourself, sort of saying like, well, wait, why do I find this to be a problem? And it's interesting because what I often saw sometimes that would make me kind of get more philosophical is that I would see people trying to solve problems without doing the process you were saying, which is like, first of all, what is the problem? And then that step wasn't really taken thoroughly, right? But then it would almost be like people would do problem solving and they would literally be trying the same recipe every single time to and expecting a different result. And I was just like, oh, like that's sad because it's like not, and both people can, often if you're witnessing this in people that are near to you, but they're in a relationship and you're witnessing them and you're just like, that's sad because both people mean well. Like, nobody has bad intentions for what they
Yeah.
do or what they say. But unfortunately, also like the road to hell is paved with good intentions sometimes. So it's not
Mhm.
enough. It's not enough. And it's almost like, I guess there's a part of it where there seems to be something about like this art of the indirect where sometimes just like yes, you need to be, there is a place for being direct, but sometimes I guess it's almost the way in which to sometimes like be so direct about something. Like I think about, it's very easy for me to think about it with children, like sometimes being very direct, like let's just say like eat your broccoli, you need to eat your broccoli, let's just say that doesn't always work, right? Because there's kind of a sense of I don't want to eat my broccoli, and it's like instead there can be this sort of sense of like just talking about vegetables and like why they are good or why they matter, or like, oh, this looks like a tree. Are we going to eat our trees? Let's eat our trees. There's like this play and indirectness that seems to be almost more directly achieving of the goal. And I think about that a lot in relationships, that I feel like there's this sort of very, and my husband and I will talk about it like this. It's kind of an out there idea, but for me, it's very concrete actually, where it's like there's this low order causality and high order causality. A lot of times we're stuck in the low order where it's just like, it just should be a direct, asked to eat broccoli, they eat broccoli, or like kids will just eat broccoli. And yeah, there can be all sorts of questions of like, kids and their listening ability and all of that. But it's a very illustrative point because I do believe that like the relationship that we have with children needs to be able to be reminiscent and like very similar to the ways we would engage with another human being, like an adult, like a grown up, right? To me, children they're little humans. They're humans too, and
Yeah.
so to sort of like just have this whole other paradigm of how they should behave when I would never just come over to your plate and be like, Vanessa, eat your broccoli. I would not do that. And like, yes, it's different when it's parents and you are trying to teach things about good nutrients and all of that. But that's why it's not about them like just being able to never eat broccoli. It's about how do you do it, right? How do you go about making that something that is like, oh, they get excited about eating vegetables or learning about vegetables versus it just being like, I hate broccoli, I hate vegetables, And it's often the indirect that really helps in that way. And yeah, I do think that's really, really interesting because it seems to be that sometimes like we do need to still be willing to address things and not be completely conflict averse, but sometimes being really like when you feel like you're being most direct, the person gets either offended or they don't understand or they're hurt and you're like, I was just trying to be clear.
Yeah.
So crazy.
Yeah, totally. I think that makes really good sense. And I really love the broccoli example. I do think that you're right, that like everything with children is just like a perfect example for everything that we discuss. And if we could just get everyone to think more like kids more of the time, I think that we'd be on the right track or a better track, perhaps. But so like when you're talking about like finding ways to sort of indirectly make the broccoli more enticing. So what I'm hearing, like a lot of what comes up in sort of my work with this existential approach is that we always have choice in the matter. And I want to be clear about that because that doesn't mean that we never have limitations and that there aren't limitations thrust upon us. Like there's tons of limitations and restrictions in this world. And I'm not saying that that they're in our mind or anything, and we're completely free of all those. But no matter how restricted our particular situation is, we always have a choice. And so a kid is a really great example of that. Kids that have so few obvious choices, so many rules and restrictions, and they get told what to do a lot. But even they like instinctively know that they have the choice to like throw a fit about eating the broccoli. And even if the rule is you got to eat the broccoli before you leave the table, they can still yell and scream. They know there's going to be consequences. Maybe they'll get in trouble for that, but they have the choice if they want to actually do it or not. So finding this like indirect way to get buy-in from them is finding a way for them to have consent, like what I would call inner consent to doing the thing, to eating the broccoli. So the choice is actually coming from within them. It's not like an external rule that they're bumping up against. It's something that, you've made a good point and now they've reflected on it. Maybe broccoli is kind of cool and I'm going to actually choose to give that a chance. So then they can do it. And that's such an important part of our active decision making, is that we actually have like our own personal consent to do it. And we're not just going against ourselves in following a rule or an expectation.
Yeah, that's so good. That was really, really great. I loved how you said that, Vanessa. And I too, like, I mean, with being a mother, like I often think about it through the child lens, or like how do children and adults and children, how's that dynamic, and how do children think about things? And because I think for me it's really helpful. And a lot of times, like, it's funny, it reminds me a lot like existential therapy, the way I was talking about how it's almost working on you as it's working on the client, right? That's a lot of how like conscious parenting would talk about parenting. It's actually reparenting, right? You're reparenting yourself as you parent your children. So it's a very, very interesting thing. And I do think there's a lot of like, I'd be interesting to kind of, I have had like a side project all about just sort of thinking about how does philosophy play into parenting, right? Like it's a very, very like just burning question for me. And one of the like closest that I have found is like, it's actually there is a school of thinking on it, but it's called objectivist parenting. So it's kind of related actually to Ayn Rand. And I think there's something good there, but there's something that I feel like is just not quite like that needs to sort of bridge something there with this idea of still needing to be able to teach things and still have a senses of rhythm. So it's not just complete chaos, right? But also not have like this sort of like, this insane controlling type of environment, because like you said, and I think that's such a brilliant point, that we do have a choice, right? Like you're saying, there are, yes, many limitations, many circumstances out of our hands, but we always have a choice, right? We always have a choice of how we're going to respond, right?
Yeah.
There's something so much about the response that has to do with like existential philosophy, right? And what are we going to say in light of this, like in light of this existential position we're in? And so for children, I think that's such a brilliant point, that they sort of instinctively know they have a choice, and so they might not be being given, like, their parent might not be giving them a choice on the broccoli, but they're like, but I'm going to exercise my choice somewhere else. Where else can I do that? No one can stop me from screaming,
Yeah.
And so that's such a powerful thing. And a lot of times, like in learning just more widely on different approaches to parenting and whatnot, there is this idea of power, right? Like that you want to sort of allow children to understand, like that they also have a type of power. It's not that they are adults or they are the parents, because parents do take on responsibilities in order to take care of their children and to keep them safe and to, again, create with them so it's not just constant chaos. But there's also a power that they have within themselves too. And learning about that power is very important, because as they get into adulthood, they need to be able to know that they can develop that from a young age, in that they have a choice of how they respond, right? You may not always, like, it's something that I'll talk a lot with my kids about, is you can't always control how you feel, right? That's not something that's in your control, right? But what you can do is take some time to take a deep breath and think about what it is that's happening, and you have a choice of how you will respond, right? Will you talk about it? Do you want to write about it? Do you want to draw about it? Or do you want to throw something about it? And these are different responses. And so, but anyways, just thinking about like this idea that you can't take the choice from the human, and that's, I think, like a big thing for, Viktor Frankl too. There's this sort of idea too in a lot of the existential philosophers, where you might be faced with like the impossible, even with death, but you still have a choice in how you even live your last few minutes on this earth, like that's a radical choice. And that's I don't know, there's just something incredibly powerful about that. And there's something that it's one of the posts that I was reading, that you had on Instagram, was this idea of our inherent freedom, right? Like, yeah, we don't have freedom over necessarily, like, we are born in a certain family or home or like state or whatever, but this idea, like, I think that's such a powerful thing to understand, because I've been thinking a lot about this concept of psychological approaches to like human nature, and like, I don't know if you've ever heard of like Maslow, but like his idea of psychology, and just different perspectives and like theological perspectives. But it's like, are we inherently good or are we inherently bad? And it's like, what I always come back to is like, no, like we're inherently free. And that, from that place, that is exactly where we can understand better the human condition. And that means that it's sort of like, it depends. I think it's hard for us to live with the bothness, though. We'd rather just kind of know, no, we're inherently good or we're inherently bad. We'd rather know that. And yet it's like, no, there's this inherent freedom that is a part of the human condition that I think is really, really important to recognize. Do you feel like sometimes, since we're talking about childhood and sort of like approaches to raising children and all of that, like, do you feel that a lot of times what you see your clients dealing with are sometimes things that are kind of rooted in childhood, like things that they may have experienced in childhood that sort of got them in a certain mindset that then they carry into adulthood? What would you say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know that sometimes people don't like to hear that cliche about everything stems from your childhood or whatever, and therapists are always wanting you to talk about your mom or whatever it is. But yeah, our early experiences sort of set us up for give us those blueprints for how we're going to engage with the world. And it's sort of like our first experiences with learning what works and what doesn't work, and what made us safe and what made us unsafe. And those, we internalize those and we take those with us for better or worse until we look at them again. And sometimes it can be sort of insidious, and we don't really realize that we're carrying these beliefs around with us that have been sort of skewing the way that we're interacting with the world. And it takes some effort to really unpack that. Other times it's more obvious, and you can see what was maybe dysfunctional about your upbringing, and it's easier to pick apart. But it's definitely, so like then that maybe happens sooner, whereas the more less obvious things could linger longer, and it also depends how curious you are about breaking cycles and all of that. But we absolutely take with us what we experience in childhood.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. It's like you're saying, I think often it's just like we get certain sense of how things work and we just carry those with us. I mean, because again, it's adaptive too. It's like maybe it wasn't actually working well, but it worked enough. And that's sort of what we take into our adulthood. It's like this is how we do things, right? This so that's very, very interesting.
And as the context changes too, like maybe we lived in a really unstable environment where we had to be super where our anxiety paid off, because to be on high alert all the time is what kept us safe. And then when we later in life are in a much safer environment where that's not really necessary to be on such high alert, then it's just like the mechanism doesn't fit anymore.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. So a question came to mind as you were talking there, Vanessa, on, just this idea of like this emphasis on phenomenology. And I know that's such a great part of what your interest is and like what your work entails. And I was wondering, it kind of makes me think about the idea that sometimes like how do we move it from sort of a knowing to like a feeling and an experiencing type of understanding of things? Because like let's say you're reflecting on your childhood, you realize there were certain things that maybe were, let's just say dysfunctional or whatever. They weren't quite right. And there were some instabilities there, and there were X, Y, or Z reasons, and that led you to do X, Y, or Z, maybe to fill a void there or a lack or whatever it was. And so somebody could like full well know this, like epistemologically, they know this, they understand this, but have a hard time sort of translating like, oh, that's why I keep doing this, whatever it is, this thing I know is like not really ultimately good for me, but I do it anyways, or it's self-sabotage or whatever, just fill in the blank. It's some sort of like habit, but perhaps the person wants to change it. How does it move from that epistemological knowledge to making that change and sort of the phenomenological aspect of it? What would you say on that note?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, because I think that if we're taking a phenomenological approach, it actually has to start with that felt sense before we even begin to analyze or try to understand, like at a cognitive level, try to reason through our experiences. We have to be able to sit with what comes up for us. And there's a lot that our body can tell us, just physiologically, about, where we carry different sensations, or if we're feeling anxious and our shoulders are up in our ears or whatever, just little things like that. And just and this is the part that we talked about earlier about sort of slowing down and sitting with that discomfort and noticing what comes up for you, what feelings, what sensations, what is it that's stirring in you, and making space for all of that to just be before we try to do anything with it, because this exists before we can make sense of it. So if you already have kind of an understanding of, oh, I can see the problems in these patterns I'm enacting, like on an intellectual level, but maybe you haven't really sat with the experience of like, well, what does that really do for you? Like when you're stuck in these patterns, what does that feel like? What are the emotions that come up for you? How is it actually impacting you and impressing on you and shaping your life? And what is like a question that I will ask early on is sort of like about the impulse. Like, what do you feel like moved to do? It's not necessarily the thing you're going to do once you've thought through it, but do you, in this moment, when you think of this problem, does it make you want to run away? Does it make you want to fight back? Does it make you want to yell and scream? What does it make you want to do? So really, like, taking that time to turn inward and be with ourselves in the experience and learning from ourselves what's coming up, because it's not enough to know that, like, on an intellectual level, like a pattern of behavior isn't helpful. Like you still have to have that felt sense of what's not helpful about it. In what way is it not helpful? What is it causing? And what do I want to be different about it?
Hmm. Yeah, that's really amazing. And I love that sense of just, you know, just really making it more about like the sensations, like what exactly, like you're saying, does it make you feel? Like what would your response be, like the fight or flight? Like what do you shut down? Like do you get hyper? Like what does this make you do or feel or think? And but really the sense of like feeling, what is it, what are the sensations? It makes me think of like just being more almost slower, like taking time to be slower with this and be almost meditative a bit, right? Like just taking time to really meditate on the actual, what is the you know, the problem, to get to what is the
Mhm.
problem, what is the problem, because so often it's just kept on that intellectual level. It's like understood, it's explained. Like my husband has this distinction between explained and addressed. It's explained, but it's not addressed. And the
Yes.
addressing is like the phenomenological side of it, where we let ourselves sit with that, we let ourselves sit with discomfort. And I think sometimes too, I wonder if maybe, yeah, I mean, a lot of it boils down to what you have brought up, which is so important, which is this idea of being able to be uncomfortable, right? I think sometimes we don't want to because we don't want to realize we're uncomfortable in it, perhaps. We don't.
Yeah.
And just because it's easier to just do what we've always done.
Hmm.
and and yeah, I mean it's a very huge risk to make change too, right? It's
Yes.
very, very risky and feels very vulnerable. Um, and yet, like we also do have this, I think we do have something in us that it desires risk because we also grow in that. We can
Yeah.
see things from a whole new vantage point when we allow that, even if it feels like a death and how uncomfortable it is. It's also a birth. I mean, for me, I think a lot of birth because when I think about the extremes of discomfort, I think about natural child labor. And I'm just like, oh my, yeah, like, because what happens, you know, when you're having like a very intense contraction, there's this desire to just like push yourself away from it, like, please, God, make it stop, you know? And yet, a lot of times that the midwives would really encourage, like, just do not try to get away from that. You need to let yourself sink into that feeling so that your body can really use that energy toward pushing the baby out eventually when you're getting, you know, once you're at that stage after transition to be able to push the baby out. And you know, it's crazy though, because everything in you is just like everything physically just is like just wants to get away from that feeling. It is because it's so
Yeah.
uncomfortable. And yet if you allow it, if you just will let yourself, you know, and that's the other thing too, screaming, it's like they, a lot of times the midwives would tell me like, just don't scream. You use that energy to internally, you know, use that energy that you're trying to basically avoid this pain by screaming. Use that breath, because it's a lot about breath, right? So use the breath
Mhm.
work to focus on pushing. So if you push the baby out, then you can be done. You know, it's like this isn't to just be in torment like all
Yeah.
forever. It's about a birth. It's about a moment of transition. It's about a new life coming into being. And so it's, and you know, but as the child is birthed, so is the mother. There's a mutual birth happening there. And but yeah, it's just like that's one of the most poignant examples that come to mind for me. But there is something about this willingness to like let yourself like you have to allow the suffering in a way. Like
Yeah.
that's to me very like Nietzschean, right? Like this, like don't avoid the suffering, don't try to get away from it. You must like embrace it, literally, quite literally, like a contraction is a type of embracing. There's like this kind of, you know, contract with it, you know, allow it to, like the birth pains, like go with it and embrace that suffering, because it actually ultimately, I mean, for his ideology, like in his philosophy, it's going to be to you know, bring about the overman, you
Yes.
know. And so yeah, I think that's super, super interesting about like taking time to go inward. And I wonder too, Vanessa, what you might say on like, what if somebody's like, well, I did try, like, like it sounds like, well, I did go inward, I tried that, you know, and sort of feeling the frustrations of like, but like what's, it's not like nothing's happening, or sort of the idea of just, yeah, what kind of would you advise at that point? Like what might be going on there for the person? And is it just a matter of like, look, like maybe you're thinking about this in a short timeline, you need to expand your timeline. Like what would you think about in that scenario?
Yeah, well, first of all, that was a really beautiful example with the childbirth,
Yeah.
and I think that yeah, just illustrates just perfectly this idea of acceptance when there's
Yeah.
a problem, if we want to call it that, that you can't do anything about something that you're avoiding. So you have to first let it in and
Yeah.
make space for it, accept that it's there, accept that it and you can both exist together, and now you can do something about it. So I just want to say I really appreciated that example.
Thank you. Thank you.
Um, and as far as like someone saying, "Oh, but I've tried," well, I mean, I would be really, I don't want to be like cynical, but I would be really curious about what they've tried. And this is the openness that I spoke of earlier, that I can't assume to know what they've tried. And I also want to validate their experience, that it is of course very frustrating, and it's effortful, um and it takes time too. That's the thing I think that people are really, well, we're all guilty of being impatient. And if we figured out a problem and we know there's a solution, so why can't it just be fixed overnight? But nothing's fixed overnight. And um, so I'm always the bearer of bad news when I have to let my clients know that like that's great, and you're doing really great work, and no, it's not going to be fixed yet. So that's the unfortunate truth. But like the more tolerance you build up to sitting with this discomfort, the more accepting you can be of it taking the time it needs. Um, and there's also not really any way of knowing how long it's going to take. Um, there's no set timeline for change. All Everyone's different, all circumstances are different, all problems are different, all things that we couldn't even guess would happen do or don't happen that alter things. So patience and openness and curiosity is key. So if someone was just feeling really frustrated that they have tried things and nothing's changing, I would just want to like help them dig into that a bit more, dig into like what, and obviously like maybe let's not keep doing things that aren't working. Like if you say I've tried this and it didn't work, well then maybe we'll try something else. And yeah, I just think that would be, first and foremost, I'd be curious about, are you frustrated with the timeline? Are you frustrated because you tried one thing and it didn't work? Are you frustrated because maybe you've tried a million things and none of them have worked because you haven't really gotten to the core of what the problem is yet? So there's just so much to unpack there that, yeah, could really change the direction of things.
Yeah, that was so good. That was great. And yeah, I love this idea of just again, like just getting curious with it, right? And just sort of saying like, well, let's ask more questions about it. And sort of that understanding too of like, it's kind of like with birth, you can't, yeah, generally like this, more or less it's going to take a certain amount of time, but you never know. You just never know. Like you never know about, all of the things that go into it. You just cannot know. You cannot know. Even like I always think that was always so powerful to me. It's like you can have an estimated, due date, but baby's going to come on their birthday. Like it's and you can't, it's like this totally out of your hands type of thing. And yet it's like it's something you're holding and yet you're not holding. It's just such a powerful thing. And then like another thing too is that the baby is not, like, it's weird because the thing we're calling a problem, right? Like, yeah, like contractions and this very, very intense discomfort is um is which is also really powerful and beautiful. I mean, it's not all bad, but that's the thing. It's like we have a really hard time accepting that something that can feel so truly painful. And some people, it depends. Some people easier. I mean, for me, I had like a lot of back labor, so it's like a lot of intense pain on the lower back, and it's like, it's just, it is painful, but that doesn't mean it's bad. Like that's the crazy thing. It's
Yes.
like, yeah, it's really, really uncomfortable, and yet so it's a problem, but yet it's actually the miracle too. It's the birth, it's the child, it's this beautiful being that your heart is just exploding with love for. So it's very, very interesting, because like we have to kind of, those are the places that often are the things that teach us the most and make us the most of who we are. And like but yeah, you have to kind of keep an open hand, because, and not sort of, I think, yeah, that probably one of the number one things that does cause frustration is those expectations of, this is when I should have already changed on this already by now, or like it should be like that, or all of the shoulds come in, right?
Yeah.
And that can really hinder the natural evolving that's actually is happening. Like the change is happening. Just like if you look at a plant every day, you won't think it's really growing, but think of it when it was a seedling from when it's blooming. Total difference. Total difference.
Absolutely.
So I think
Yeah.
that's really powerful.
And I think you're right too about the I think I don't know the right language to use for this, but not good isn't necessarily bad. So like things that aren't pleasurable aren't inherently or aren't automatically bad things. So like you described like the pains of childbirth, like that's not pleasurable, but it's not something bad that's happening. Ultimately,
Exactly.
there's goodness in this situation that goes beyond the more surface level displeasure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's such a great point. That's such a great point. And yeah, I another thing is coming to mind that I'll say, and then I want to ask you a bit more on like, well, two questions come to mind for you specifically in your work and in your own like personal experience and who you are. But like I think about the fact that birth, death, um, all of these things hold this crazy pleasure pain sort of dynamic that goes on there. And I wonder sometimes if things that ultimately maybe are real things that maybe somebody needs to make a change in, or like, let's say I'm just doing something, it's really not actually good or whatever, but, or, let's just take an example of somebody who's, not, is maybe participating in things that, or habits or something that are not ultimately healthy habits, or they're destructive, self-sabotaging. Let's just take self-sabotage so I can make it a little bit more clear what I'm trying to say. Like if somebody's doing self-sabotage, I kind of wonder if it's almost like we get the pleasure pain dynamic, but it's always there. Like there's always this bothness happening, but it's sort of like in the wrong directionality or something. Because for somebody who maybe has tendencies of self-sabotage, what they're doing is, like, in a way, it's a painful thing that they end up doing to themselves, but they enjoy, there's something that is pleasurable about that. Otherwise, why would they kind of keep doing that? And so I wonder if it's like, and I guess this is the main question here then. What is it, how do we sort of identify or be able to evaluate, like, oh, this pleasure pain dynamic of self-sabotage is probably not as good, or is on a different level. Like I'd like to elevate to a level where I'm not self-sabotaging. I'd like to experience another type of pleasure pain dynamic, that's actually toward life and like, not sabotage, but like growth and flourishing and abundance and all of that. So I don't know, what are your thoughts there? Because I think that's very interesting to me personally.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that in general, everything we do is for a reason. Like there's a purpose behind. So for self-sabotaging, we're getting something out of that. So it could be, like you said, there's some sort of pleasure that's derived from that, or it could be a strategy to avoid a perceived greater harm. So if their risk is perceived as like even greater than the self-sabotage, then it could actually just be the lesser of the two evils. So if does that make sense? But
yeah.
Okay.
No, that makes sense. Yeah. I guess I'm wondering then, like, so in that case, it's almost like the person may feel very, very much like, and yeah, this is kind of a superficial level, but they might be like, yeah, no, I am embracing suffering because look what I'm willing to do to myself.
Yeah.
So it's like there's a justification, I wonder, in that, where it's like, no, I am. And I've thought like extensively about like the topic of suffering and like being a martyr, or like, and I think that sometimes it's like, well, the emphasis is so much on on actually the fact that you're identifying, like the I think the problem with staying in self-sabotage as like, oh yeah, no, I am doing a pain pleasure dynamic, and that's what it is to be human, is like, but you're identifying in a sense with that one mode, like this one approach that what a person might be constantly using. And actually it's ultimately an avoidance of harder suffering and harder, and like, I guess it gets kind of interesting because it's like for example, if somebody has a hard time asking for help, or saying like, I just really need a day where I can like take a really nice long bath. I don't know. I'm just came up with some. It's funny because it might actually be really hard for them to ask for help for doing something that is usually considered easy or luxury or pleasure or something. You know what I'm saying? It's very weird because, and so they're like, I would almost rather just be, not ask for myself because I'd rather serve other people, which is a great premise and a good thing to do as like a human, to serve other human beings. But if it gets to the point where it might be that the person's overlooking like something, just a very basic need or something, like just let's say whatever it is. Let's just say this person really gets recharged by like a long bubble bath or something. Well, like that's something that you see what I'm saying? It's almost like, well, I'm just embracing suffering. Like, not that it's like, there are obviously way worse sufferings in the world than not having a bubble bath, but you get what I'm saying? Like, these are the justifications people do in their heads, where that could even be a reason. There's like, well, there are people out there like in countries with civil war, so I shouldn't ask for a bubble bath. Like, I'm so selfish, or something like that. Right. Or like, yeah. I'm embracing suffering. I must be like growing as an existential human being because I'm not, but actually the suffering is to ask. Like so I think it's really seems to be about like this problem of identifying with a certain mode where you're like, well, I am just like, this is what I do, and it's easy for me to do this because I'm not used to it. It's all about this idea of like the ease, and then being able to put ourselves into the vulnerability place again. I think that can, I wonder if can maybe like identify how to say, oh, right, like self-sabotage is not the pain pleasure dynamic. That pain pleasure dynamic is not actually as fruitful as the other pain pleasure dynamic, which would be to, let's say, not avoid, let's say, a relationship because it's scary, right? Like, so yeah, that's hard. But if you always never do it because you're like, well, I might fail there, it's kind of like you're saying, these lesser of two evils, right? Or these lesser of two sufferings or something like that. So anyways, that was a lot, but thanks for letting me share.
No, I really appreciate that. That was really interesting. Yeah, and I like, it gets me curious then about the purpose behind the suffering. So the not asking for the time for the bubble bath because, and then saying, oh, well, I embrace suffering by denying myself. But what comes of that? Like, is there anything fruitful that comes of that suffering? Whereas the suffering involved in the vulnerability and the struggle it would take to actually ask for the bubble bath time that you need, that is a means to an end, because there is something meaningful that comes out of it, because then you get to take care of yourself. And in the dynamic where you were talking about like being of service to others, we can't be of service to others if we're not taking care of ourselves, because we're not able to operate optimally. Just sort of like putting the mask on in the airplane before you help the next person. Like, you can't help someone put their mask on if you've already passed out because you're not
I didn't get enough oxygen. Come on.
Yeah. So, and like, we're constantly in this balance between like self and others, because we do not exist in any sort of like siloed vacuum of like individuality. We're all connected to everybody and everything all the time. So others are impacting us and we're impacting them. So when we think of like this suffering, like I'm also curious about those dynamics too, and those relational dynamics of who is being impacted in what ways by these different struggles.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really important too. And I think that's a great analogy of like the airplane mask. I'm gonna remember that one for sure. That's great. Yeah, and also it's kind of funny because I think if we get more in touch with reality, which is that we're in this kind of ecology of existence, right? We're in this sort of symbiotic relationship. So the idea of just perpetual, output of service, while there's something that, could potentially be good about that, if it's like, well, yeah, like, I mean, it's just kind of like trying to pour out of an empty cup, essentially, or like try to,
Yeah,
help somebody else when you're, you've passed out because you didn't get your oxygen mask on in the airplane. And like, I think what's interesting too is kind of like just take the perspective to say like, well, you're also an other to someone else. Like you're yourself to you, but like you're also an other. So trying to see the other in ourselves, I think, is very, very, very helpful, because then it puts things into a different perspective then, and kind of gets us out of our functional fixedness of the way we see things, the way we see like our decisions even, or how the way we think about things. Yeah.
absolutely. I think that that distinction, that we're simultaneously subject and object
Yes.
at all times, is so important. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So two questions that I would love to ask you, Vanessa, are one, what was like your main drive and like gusto for wanting to do existential therapy? Like what was it that was like, yes, I just like, have you for a long time wanted to do something like this? Like, did you always know, or was it something that you like suddenly learned about and you're like, wow, that's really fascinating? And like, what was your main drive for doing it? And then the second question, I want to ask you more about your thesis. So those are the things I want to bring up.
sure. Um, yeah, so there's so many different approaches to therapy. And at some point along in the training, you learn about all the different approaches and you eventually have to pick one. And so many of them just felt like problem solving to me. And like I had mentioned, I'd always been sort of philosophically minded. Like as a kid, I always liked to sit with these big questions that other kids don't. I don't know. So I always had that bent. And so when I learned that there was existential therapy, like I am always more drawn to like the inquisitive side of things rather than the fixing of things, which I don't know what that sounds like as a therapist. It sounds like I'm not helping people or anything. But I I am endlessly fascinated by mystery and intrigue and trying to understand things better and getting closer and closer to what it is we're trying to understand, and just sitting in all of that uncertainty and unknown and just grappling with all of these big things. So when I learned that is a therapeutic approach, I was instantly sold. I was like, oh, well, I don't want to just give people some worksheets and tell them to how they can just like quickly change their habits or something. I want to help people sit with this, because if people can learn how to, I mean, everyone has their own bias for therapeutic approaches. So I'm sure a CBT therapist would argue my point. But yeah, I think that developing that skill set in therapy to be able to sit with the discomfort, slow down, really develop an awareness of what's happening, and pulling back the layers before even remotely jumping into trying to interpret and problem solve is something that will then, like, no one can ever take that skill set away from you once you've learned it. And you can go through life if you continue to see the world phenomenologically. I think that is such a great gift and a great tool for anyone to have in their life.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's so beautifully said, Vanessa. So it sounds like you knew you wanted to go in the route of like being a therapist. Like, had that just been something since your childhood that was interesting to you to do counseling, or were you more interested in psychology, or yeah, what was that interest for you?
Yeah, that was sort of like I kind of just put like one foot in front of the other and ended up here. I definitely have always been interested in people. I also like in my undergrad, I minored in history, and it all kind of feels the same to me. I just like learning about people and why people are the way they are and why they interact with others the way they do, and how this whole world works and in its deeply interconnected ways. So that's something that's always interested me. So I just yeah, continued with that in my studies with both of those. And it came a point when I had to decide like what path would lead to an actual job in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I went with the counseling route of psychology. And yeah, I've been there ever since.
Wow, that's amazing. So, so cool. Thank you for sharing more about that, Vanessa. And yeah, I was kind of wondering, like, with your work on your thesis, like, what is your thesis about? If you're, I'm not sure if you're able to talk about it or not. I'm not sure how that works, but yeah, if you're able to talk about it or share with me about it, I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've actually I did a master's degree before my PhD. So there was actually two research projects involved in these. So and they're related. That's why I bring it up. Um, but so I'm very interested in this idea of self and in relation to others and how it is we come to understand ourselves. In the context of being in relation with others and the influence others have on us and we have on them, and just that greater context. And so then even more specifically, I was interested, this sort of happened a bit spontaneously when I was doing my master's thesis. My mom is an adoptee, and she was doing some sort of family ancestry tracing and really trying to find out more about her history and how that impacted how she sees herself today. So that was the population I ended up working with, was with adoptees, and like this idea of self in relation to um, well, what is your family? Like, are you missing a part of yourself because you don't have that biological connection, or do you identify with your adoptive family, or what? How is that how do those influence your sense of self? So in the first study, I actually spoke with adoptees and their children, their adult biological children, to see what of sort of that adoption story is passed down through the generations. And it was really beautiful to see the interactions of parent and child, even just in the interviews, having them share stories with each other that they'd never shared before. And so that was really beautiful to see those relational dynamics and how they've come to understand themselves based on what they understand about the people who've come before them, and how that's sort of shaped the landscape that they were born into and who they've become. So I'm continuing on that in with adoptees again in the research I'm working on right now. Looking a little bit more in detail at like this idea of sense of self and how we exist embedded in these relationships and embedded in these greater context, whether it's family or culture or what have you, that that influence how we see ourselves.
Mm. That's so cool. Thank you so much for sharing more about that. That's awesome. That's really interesting. I love how it's so personal to you because of your mother and her
Yeah.
experience and how that impacts even your own experience. And yeah, I have because I have like there's adoption in my extended family, like it's brought a lot of questions to my mind too about just sort of like just what you're really getting at with this idea of like, is one kind of missing out if they don't have the biological aspect of their mother, because there is such a phenomenological tie between
Mm-hmm.
mother and baby. And yet like people can feel like they truly have a family and a sense of home, in their adopted family, and then there's also the thought that comes to mind of how sometimes people who unfortunately feel very um uncomfortable in their own home, where they may find family more in their friends, they might find more of
Yeah.
their sense of home with their friends or whatever. So it's really 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 interesting because it kind of like it kind of expands the understanding. But I think like because we exist because basically two people come together, a baby is born. And that is so fascinating to me because it always shows this kind of there's actually a term in Buddhism called like dependent origins. We actually have like, we're always kind of coming from some sort of interconnectedness of
Yes.
generations, and like I think about the Christian theological point of like communal ontology, like the idea of the Trinity, this kind of constant nexus. And I do think that's really, really fascinating. And actually something that seems unrelated, but it seems related to me at least, is that I think, like, I wonder if not being as aware of the fact that we have this, this constant, ourself is always constantly connected to a greater existence of like other people, then I wonder if this makes like if for some reason dating is coming to mind, because I don't know, the other day I had this thought and I'm like, wow, like it's really crazy because sometimes people say like, oh, you're also going to marry the person's family, but there is something really important about understanding that you are kind of marrying into a family. Like this is,
Yeah.
and other cultures in the East in particular, more so than I think Western cultures, have a way better sense of this. And that's why there's even still people who arrange marriages, or at least have high input from their family on who they should maybe marry. um, and I think that's just really, really fascinating, because I wonder if that gives people very little bearings on who they are really relating to in their date, in their courtship, in their dating, and in their obsession sometimes, because a lot of times, romance and feelings and love and like and all of that is so all consuming, and it's such a powerful force. And yet it's often toward what is, I don't want to say it's not that it's completely illusory, but it's reduced, right? Because you're seeing it just for that person, and yes, they are a culmination in a sense of all that has come before them or from their contexts that they've been in. But in a way, it can be easy to forget to also see the bigger picture of where they come from, of who they are from, and what has gone into making them who they are today. Because it might be fine if it stays in like teenage dating, but if it moves into like a long-term serious relationship or marriage or something like that, you are bringing family cultures together that don't show just in like the fun, flirtation and dates that happen in just like the onset of dating.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating to me.
Yeah.
That's I could speak for hours on that. I think,
Oh, good. I love
but
that.
like no, I think it's so interesting. I don't think that any one person is ever just one person. Like we're all like are situated on this sort of like web of existence where we're all connected to like all these other people. And yeah, just like everything you said about like the different like merging families and family cultures, and then but there's even more than that too. There's like all the different people that are involved in their life in different social contexts, like their community, their friends, their the kind of work that they do and the people they associate with in their work. Just like there's so many different interconnected pieces to our existence um that you don't initially see when you first meet a person. So that's so fascinating.
It is. It really, really is. And I wonder if it's sort of like, it kind of makes me think of like, it's funny that there are terms like profile and stuff like that, like on, let's say dating sites or whatever,
Yeah.
or even social media just generally. But like, the profile of a person ultimately, it makes me think of like a profile makes a silhouette. So there's something very that kind of makes two-dimensional,
Yeah.
what is like actually three-dimensional, and like what, and
Yes.
like our existence and ourself seems to come so much more from this dynamic interplay of it's like you and other and then others, so it's this like very
Huh.
dynamic interplay that then goes into the self, making the self. And I think too, like, I don't know, I don't know when this random thought came to my mind, but it's a topic that interests me a lot too, because I have been thinking too from a learning, like there's a lot to think about self from theological perspectives or religious perspectives. And I've learned through Javier Rivera more on Buddhism and like this idea of the no self, right? The concept is that the self is actually a no self, but it's not as if like there's just nothing there and we're just this literally holograms. It's this idea that we have such it's almost like there's such a fullness of self that it cannot be pinned down to one concrete self, like you're saying. And that's really, really important, because I wonder if we could get more in touch with this on a regular basis. And I'm sure that's why, like in Buddhism, like meditation and certain practices are done to put the person more in touch with this. And this also happens, like I brought up with Christian theology, like the idea of communal ontology. There's these participatory communal acts that sort of remind people, like, oh, we're like the body of Christ, and like this concept of we're actually part of this nexus. But anyways, the point of the matter is like, I do think that I wonder if it would be helpful for us whenever we are going through some sort of mental instability or struggle or something, to remember that we are part of something larger. Because when we don't, it's very self-isolating. We shut ourselves off. We sort of get very fixed about what's happening, right? Like we don't ask all the questions about like, what is this problem? Is it a problem? How is it a problem? All of that. And I guess what I'm trying to say is like, there's a really strange, interesting thing about realizing this interconnectedness that then sort of alleviates us and draws us in a way. It's like it draws us out to not be so stuck in whatever we feel ourselves to be going through or what we are going through. It's not to dismiss that, but it's to say that, it's to say, look, if we realize this broader self, right, of selves, then it also allows us to sort of take different perspectives and like take different viewpoints on it, so we don't get so fixed in this sort of singular viewpoint of what it is and how it is, and we just get very, very stuck there. But I also think this is very ironic in a way, because it's like somehow in allowing ourselves to get drawn out of that depressive like isolation, we get drawn out of that when we realize our connection with the world, right? But we also, it's almost like as we get further outside of ourselves, that also takes this like deepening inside of ourselves, right? It's like this dual action that's happening, I think, because you're saying about this phenomenological approach is like being able to sit with oneself and be able to allow yourself to go inward and sense, what are you sensing? What are you feeling? How does it make you feel? What does it make you want to do? All of that actually takes this real sense of inner practice and inner sitting and time, right? Meditative time. And so I think this is really fascinating, because somehow doing that, it's like this ability to do that inward work also allows you to be outward, or maybe the recognition of the outward actually makes your inner work more fruitful or something. It's just very, very interesting that we've got this dynamic happening. So anyways, thank you for letting me share that.
I think that dynamic is absolutely essential. I think there's like, you have our inner world and our outer world, and they both have to be in dialogue. Like you have to, everything that you're reflecting on like internally is also, you're reflecting on your encounter with the outside world. And so it's both. It's never one or the other. And I think that like what we should strive for, I don't like to say should, but what we should strive for is a balance between the two, is that to have both these inner reflections and these outward perspectives in dialogue with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And something kind of interesting that comes to mind is just the idea too of, there is something that bolsters the individual, right? Even though there is really, there's a risk in using the language of individual, but there are, there are people, right? We have like, I'm Michelle, you're Vanessa. Like there are people who, at least there's like this sense of there are people, they have personalities, they have their own stories, right? But that individual is connected to all these selves. And there's something though that bolsters the self in recognizing your connection to other human beings through time. Like thinking about birth again, something that really got me through birth mentally was to think, many women have done this and they've done it. And like, it's a kind of empowering to know I can do this too, because they've done it and I'm going to, I can do this too. So it's very interesting how that can really, there's a sense of camaraderie. I mean, I know I don't want to distill it just to that, but it kind of allows us to realize that we're not alone. Like we're not the only ones who've ever faced this type of an issue or a struggle or whatever it is. And that really, there is something really quite powerful about being then in your own self, finding the strength to push through that,
Yeah, like all these others can sort of buttress like our own efforts. And yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess then it also, and this feeds back to what got brought up a little bit before, but it does really because like I was saying, in being an identical twin sister, for me, it was always like there's a really wild level of like quite literally visual even affirmation of self in like somebody looking just like you, who is like
Yeah.
you, who, you know, you kind of affirm each other in and verbally process the same way and all of that, right? And I think that I wonder because there's kind of, it seems like there's two routes that people can go with encountering this reality of being comprised of selves, right? There's one route where you either just say like you just kind of like mute yourself. You're just like, nope, like I'm just gonna mute. We'll let all the other selves be very vibrant. But you know, I think that muting is that, you know, to be able to shine is that vulnerability though too. To be able to say, no, I will insert myself into the nexus of selves, but there's a responsibility there. Like, what would that cause? What will
Mhm.
that do? So the one approach is just to mute. The other is like to become like this raging fire, right? It's like, ah, like I'll be like the light, like everything else, like it will dim in comparison. I'll just be like this raging fire. And I think what it's more like is that we're all like a candle, right? We're all like these little lights, and they can ignite fires, but they can go out. So they have the potential. And sometimes you do need a fire, right? And sometimes you need it to be dark so you can see the stars. So there's a need for both, right? But what I mean to say is merely that I think it's very fascinating because there, I guess I'm thinking like maybe while recognizing that there are other selves could maybe make somebody say, well, I should just dim down so the others can, so I can ensure that they're getting to shine, or like that they're getting, there's almost a way in which it's like, but no, they rely on you shining too. Like there's a way in which it's like, no,
Yes.
you have a part too. Like this is a circuit. If your circuit parts, like if there's something that's kind of a in the circuit, it's not, the whole thing's not going to light up or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like Christmas lights, you know, finding that one bulb that
Yes.
doesn't work. Like, where is
Exactly.
it? So the thing can work again. But yeah, I guess
Yeah.
I'm just thinking like that's interesting. I wonder what causes people to either take those two approaches. You know, do you think it just comes from sort of a sense of protection? Is it just like merely adaptive to be like, oh, it was safer for me to dim, or it was safer for me to flare up? Like, where would you say that comes from usually?
Yeah, I think that for the most part, it's what has served you in the past, what has been the safest approach. And this is the sort of stuff that, as we spoke about earlier, goes back to our earliest childhood experiences. Did we get what we need by being loud, or was there a risk to us being loud and we were actually safer if we were quiet?
Yeah.
So, and um, yeah, the sort of things that we internalize early on and then can are either like confirmed or disconfirmed later in life as they continue to work for us or not work for us is how they could possibly change. But for the most part, I'd say that it's just what's been adaptive.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, I really appreciate getting to talk more about this with you. And I love hearing more about your specific interests, like that this is an interest to you. And I think that's great because I love this topic too. It's so interesting for me. So another question that's coming to mind too that I just wanted to ask you real quick was this idea of phenomenology and our technological landscape. And do you think that do you think there are like what are the pros and cons do you think in this new technological landscape, virtual landscape, for people to be able to use phenomenological approaches to handling things that they're having a hard time with? Like, do you think that
Mm.
it's kind of making it harder, or just like, I guess, yeah, I guess I'm just interested in that because, well, I'll just say like personally, I feel like there can be though there's really great things about the virtual landscape that can be quite motivating and encouraging, especially if you do have an inner project or like an intrinsic motivation to do some X thing, whatever. If not, I wonder if like instead of going inward, we don't, how to put this? It's like we, I just think technologies are very, very interesting. Well, technology, that's so broad. Specifically, like the internet and virtual spaces are very interesting to me, especially the internet, because it kind of takes you outside and inside at the same time, right? Like you use it
Yeah.
in this private portal, and yet it's connecting you to like the World Wide Web, you know? And so I'm really, really interested in that because I want to say like, because it's uncomfortable sometimes to sit with yourself and to sit with what feels difficult. I wonder if in a time like there's always things people could find to distract themselves with. but I wonder if it's like just such an easy distraction. Like it's such an easy access thing that can be used to sort of just not allow the person to sit with themselves, because basically anytime someone sits with themselves today, they most likely have like within reach, within a tap away, like, and, access to, the internet, if whatever they want to do on the internet. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Not that that's bad. Internet can be really good. It's just, yeah, it does make things a little bit different these days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that it's a bit of a double-edged sword, which I don't want this answer to sound like a total cop-out, but I think it depends on how you're using it, because it definitely can be so distractions aren't always bad. Sometimes distractions are helpful. They can be a coping mechanism that aren't always a bad thing. Like sometimes we need a distraction, but they can, like, if you don't want to ever face yourself, you do not have to. And the internet makes it that much easier. The fact that we have our phones on us all the time, and we can look at other people's lives, or we can see anything, watch anything, go anywhere without having to move from our seat. If we can be in complete avoidance of being in relation with ourselves all the time if we want to. And that calls into question social media too, because there's sort of like the potential for false connections, or like we think that we know people or in relationship with people, but those aren't actual relationships, like for the most part. And again, like I said, it's really a double-edged sword, because it depends how you use it. You could use all of these tools for self-reflection. You could use them to actually cultivate real relationships and connections with people that you would never otherwise have the chance to connect with. Like you and me, for instance.
Yeah.
It's a great example. Like we would have never even known each other existed, let alone had the chance to talk to each other if it hadn't been for the internet. But I also could just sit on Instagram and look at celebrities and not think about important things. And think that I know these people, and the way that we do get glimpses into people's lives on social media like that kind of gives the illusion that we do know them. Like it's possible to know an absurd amount about people on the internet that we don't actually know at all. And then it makes us feel like we're encountering them, but we're not really encountering them. So I think that just to be really mindful and careful with all of these things is the best solution, because it could so easily go in either direction.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's not a cop out of an answer. I think that's beautiful. It was a wonderful, wonderful answer. And yeah, I mean, yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on it's all about like really the how, like how is one using it? And I think that's really, yeah, that's really interesting. I think really true what you said. It's just a lot about like, well, in what way? It's like anything, right? Anything can be used in a way that's destructive or is creative, Um, do just really quick, thinking back on how when working with clients and this idea of like, things being held or carried in the body itself, did you is that something that's like an interest of yours, or like did you do that as part of your studying or learning to be an existential therapist? Because I'm like, I have dance in my background, and like I love like massage therapy and all of that, and so it's like I'm really interested in how the body like does literally hold tension in certain places, or like how you can tell certain things from what your body's doing or showing you, or where you feel tense. And yeah, I'm interested in that, because I guess I'm wondering, like, because we do live in a kind of, how do I put this? Well, let's just say this, like the virtual spaces and internet is not really quite putting us phenomenologically in touch with things as much, right? So we can get a bit disconnected from our own bodies, I think.
Yes.
And so I wonder if that was, yeah, I'm just curious about if that's a part of existential therapy, or like, do you ever kind of work with, I don't know, like, I wonder if existential therapists, would you work with people who maybe do more like touch therapy or things like that? So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think psychologically speaking, the body and the mind are not separable. This sort of embodiment therapies or somatic therapies aren't my area of expertise. There are people that like have their whole practice around that would know way more about this than me, but I do think it's extremely important, and I do work with it to like the degree that I can, because absolutely our bodies are the first place in which we exist in the world. Like we are in our body first, and then our body is in the world, and so our body is very, very central to how it is we're experiencing the world. And then our body carries experiences in different ways. And yeah, I think I may have lost track of your question a little bit, but like it's really, really interesting to me, and it's something that I always like to learn more and more about and talk about people's experiences, because yeah, that's absolutely like a foundational part of even through an existential lens too, just being embodied in the world.
Yeah, no, that's so good. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing more about that. And yeah, yeah, it's something too where like it's not, it's something where it's like I have not like formally studied it all in it at all, but like whenever it comes up, if anytime I'm like, whether it's like just randomly on Instagram something comes up about like the vagal nerve, or like just I'm just like, oh, like I'm just so fascinated, it's so interesting, but I think there is this bothness that's important, right? Because somebody could be like there's something about the fact that if somebody's like getting tension released, let's say even just like basically like in massage, great, wonderful avenue. Wish it was a bigger part of like Western culture to understand like massage therapy and touch therapy and things like that. But the thing is that like if you're doing that and it's like that can probably I'm sure that in and of itself can be helpful, but there are also ways in which there seems to be like I could see there being an even greater benefit in doing sort of some of the body and mind work, where it's sort of like understanding sort of like the mindset work, right? But it's interesting because I feel like this is much more what's the right word? It's just much more practice, just to use a basic word. It's much more practiced in Eastern culture, like where you see the connection between the body and the mind, and sort of these particular even practices, or even martial arts. Like think about martial arts or meditations, types of postures or things like that that are done that sort of put the mind and the body in some sort of like greater connection. And I'm just thinking to myself now, like just crazy out there question, I'm like, what do we have in the West for that? Like what do we have something like that? Like I guess there is sort of a sense in which like working out can be a good way to get out your stress, and then you're raising your endorphins, and that's all good stuff. Like that's really, really good. But it's also it's sort of like I feel like you have to kind of be more intentional about connecting the mind and the body work, and it's not always just something that is like there's just some sort of practice we have in the Western culture that does that. It's kind of interesting, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you that that's lacking in our culture. I think that, I mean, optimistically speaking, I think that we're doing work like in the area of mental health to really try to bridge that connection a bit more, and I'm seeing more and more of it, which is really encouraging to me. More and more it's being acknowledged that like the mind and body aren't separable, and they influence each other. And we see that a lot with things like chronic pain, even that or people with sort of undiagnosed pain that they've been to doctors forever and they can't find out what's wrong with them, so it must be in their head, they must be crazy, go see a shrink. And then but like everything, so then maybe the medical field is a bit behind in acknowledging those connections, but like I guess I'm hopeful that I think that we're getting there, and there's more and more work being done in this area, and that's really just really inspiring to me, because I think it's so important.
Yeah, no, absolutely, definitely. Yeah, and I think Yeah, and I think like ultimately going back to just the practice of existential therapy can help even navigating those waters. It's very challenging if somebody's dealing with like chronic pain, for example, and they're like, did I do something wrong? Am I thinking wrong? And then they can be a more paranoid spiral of thinking. And it's like a lot of times it's things that need to be released. Like it needs to be released out of them or out of their system to be able to, you know, just be able to have that let go happen so that that pain too can pass through them. But it's sort of like, yeah, it's kind of like we need the dialectic, we need the allopathic doctors who can also work with those who maybe have more of a holistic mindset or can think about how the mind and the body are connected, um, so that it's there are more solutions for people and there's real hope for people and breakthroughs for people. So yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so cool. Thanks for letting me bring that up too as well. But yeah, I just think like the existential, like you're saying, it's so like we are in our bodies, we live in our bodies, and so there's something about the body itself that is very existential, right? It's the very means by which we have existence. So that's just very, very fascinating. But I honestly, like, I just feel like I could talk with you so much more because I have so many more questions and thoughts that come to mind on this topic. But I've loved so much the discussion we've had, Vanessa. And yeah, is there anything else you wanted to share though with us before we close our conversation? We'll have to do a part 2 though, because
Oh, yeah, I
there's
know.
more to
That's what
talk
I was
about.
thinking. Yeah, I'm not sure there's anything I could say in a way that would start to wrap things up well. I would just keep going. So I think I'll maybe just wait till part 2 because I've really, really enjoyed talking with you
Yeah.
and I would love to do it again.
Me too. I would love to do that as well. And yeah, I'm gonna actually ask if you could share with us how people could find you, like if people are looking to maybe do existential therapy or maybe want to practice it themselves one day. Like, could you tell us your website or where people could find you if they want to contact you?
Yeah, just verbally.
Yeah, just
Okay.
yeah, verbally or
Uh,
like where they can find you on Instagram. Maybe it's
yeah,
like long or something, so it's like, oh, they'll probably remember. But yeah, just go ahead because they'll also have it in the link like in the description. So
yeah.
don't
So
worry, it'll also be there.
all of my links are just Vanessa Bork Counseling. So on Instagram or Facebook, it's just at Vanessa Bork Counseling. My website's Vanessa Bork Counseling. I think even just Vanessa Bork will get you there.
Awesome.
Um, but counseling with 2 L's, the Canadian spelling.
That's so funny to me. I was like, oh, right. Like I know some of them like honor or certain things that are spelled differently, but I was like, I did not know that about counseling. That's so fascinating that there's like the 2L versus the 1L. So
Yeah, I know, like in the academic world with um it's so split between things being published in Canada or in journals in the States and that. So I sometimes forget which is the Canadian and which is the spelling the American because I use both all of the time and I have to really think about it sometimes.
yeah, no, I'm sure that would be tricky sometimes, but it's funny too because like English, like I don't know, I guess English in general becomes kind of a very sort of international language, but it's like, but which exact version? Because there are going to be these funny discrepancies sometimes if it's
Yeah,
in Canada or the UK. So that's really, really interesting. But
exactly.
yeah, okay, wonderful. Well, that's how people can find you or your website, which is great. I love your website. I love the work you do and what you share on Instagram. It's very encouraging. Anyone can benefit from learning from you and from the existential therapy and what you do. So thank you for what you do, Vanessa. And I can't wait to talk with you for another conversation sometime. So thank you again.
Likewise, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa.